So good morning, everybody. My name is Matthew Baird. I am the founder of the Social Housing Roundtable, but I've been involved in social housing recruitment now for the last 10 years. I love the sector. I'm a board member for Spring Housing. I'm a member of a few different forums, and I chair a supported housing networking event. So I kind of get involved in a number of different areas. But the idea behind the roundtable was that we could bring people together every week to discuss a different topic in the wider social housing world to really try and make change. I never want these just to be a forum for people to sit and complain and whinge and kind of go, great, well, that was a useful bit of time. They're always to kind of come away with ideas and make change and get people thinking. Now, Judith, when did you and I meet? I'm trying to remember when the conference actually was. Because I know we met at it was the Birmingham supported housing.
Yeah, I think it was the first time I'd been out after COVID, so I was a bit giddy. It was probably, it was in April or May this year sometime.
It seems to have flown by. It seems like it was only just a few moments ago, but we are nearly in December.
It was Eddie Hughes was our minister then, so we can probably gauge it by housing ministers.
Probably. And it was a really, really interesting event, and I think there was a lot there needing to kind of change and be discussed. But you and I were talking about obviously your work with Daha, and I was like, look, at some point we need to arrange a roundtable. And yes, it's taken till nearly December, but we'll get there. So I'll pass over to you to kind of do your introductions and really kind of where the conversation for today came about, and I guess why we're bringing it forward now.
Yeah, no, great. So yeah, it came about because housing has such an important role to play in identifying domestic abuse and responding in the most appropriate way. And I kind of talk a little bit more about that. But I think, and then we had a chat, didn't we? And we're in the 16 days of activism, which is, as many of you, I'm sure, who are here will know, starts on the 25th of November, the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls International Day. Also happens to be sort of White Ribbon Day as well, which is the Men Against Violence Against Women and Girls, which is really useful but is quite separate. And it ends on the 10th of December, the 16 days, which is Human Rights Day. So it's a really good kind of period of time to really focus on what's going on in the world. It's obviously an international thing around violence against women and girls, and so it's a really important period, and we've chosen in Daha this time to celebrate good practice. So I've been doing that on a daily basis on Twitter, and I've just reminded myself I haven't done it, so I'm also the comms team. So yeah, but I think what's really kind of useful is just a little bit of background to the international against elimination of violence against women, and just to tell you a little bit about where it came from. And it commemorates, and lots of people I think don't know this, it commemorates the death of three sisters, the Mirabel sisters. So Patria, Minerva and Maria Teresa, three sisters who lived in the Dominican Republic whilst the country was under dictatorship. And it was a really kind of brutal time, and those who stood in his way, and it's a Trujillo, I think you pronounce it, Rafael Trujillo. If you stood in his way, you were imprisoned, tortured and murdered effectively. And there were sort of a mass murder of thousands of Haitians who living in the Dominican Republic, and his reign lasted 31 years, so it's absolutely horrific to live there. So these three sisters actively opposed that sort of his cruel and systematic violence effectively, and led to an underground movement to challenge his regime. And they had a fourth sister, Didi, who didn't join them in the activism, but was kind of there with them as well. And they all experienced threats, and he would sort of often order people to arrest and harass them. An absolutely horrific time, and obviously it kind of ended on the 25th of November 1960, when the three of them were murdered very brutally. And I think, just as kind of long story short, because their story is really fascinating and the work that they did was really fascinating, but it was then, right, we've got to do something about, because it is all around male violence. It was all around that sort of dictatorship, and we talk about domestic abuse very often in the terms of a dictatorship, and some of the kind of, in training, some of the exercises you do around dictators, and how they kind of rule the country with this sort of air of fear, and all of the tools that we know that perpetrators of domestic abuse use. So it's just a really pivotal time, and the United Nations then, just right, we've got to keep thinking about these women. We've got to never forget these women. We've got to commemorate what they stood for, what they tried to achieve, and what they did achieve, because things did change after they were murdered. And I think it just is that kind of reminder. And I know, and I haven't kind of framed this particularly well, because I don't know whether we have got any men on here, but just to be aware that we are very, very aware that men do. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Judith.
You're just an honorary, one of us. Sorry.
Hi, good morning. Is that Oliver?
Hello, Oliver. Hi, Oliver. Right, so 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 it is really important that men do experience domestic abuse. We do know that, and there is nothing in anything that we do that sort of diminishes the experience of men who experience domestic abuse. And we know that particularly men in same-sex relationships can experience domestic abuse more frequently, more regularly. And we know that interfamilial violence with sons, fathers, siblings, really prevalent, particularly, and with those kind of ending in homicide. And I guess the sort of key thing is there, again, it's around male violence. But we do know that men absolutely, and everybody, deserves a service. And it's really important that we frame that, but it's really important also, and just thinking about the Mirabel sisters, is that this is rooted in patriarchy. So domestic abuse is rooted in male violence against women and girls. It is rooted in the patriarchy, and as with the sort of dictators, that superiority. And we still have that problem today. There is still a patriarchal system and society that is damaging for women, but it's also very damaging for men and boys as well. And we can't get away from the fact that 2 to 3 women every single week in this country are murdered as a result of domestic abuse. We know from research, and there's a lot more research happening right now, that at least probably 10 women, I have to caveat that with probably 10 women, die by suicide every week as a way out of domestic abuse. So we have to, and my language will fall into she as a victim, survivor, he as a perpetrator. And I don't make apologies for that. However, I do want to be really clear, because obviously as all the women on here know, we're constantly challenged about, what about the men? And it is a really important question, but the everything kind of leads to tell us that this is an issue of male violence against women and girls, and that's where we have to focus an awful lot of resources, but we have to consider what resources are available to ensure that we create an environment for men to be able to come forward. So I just wanted to kind of caveat that, so I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent, but I just
I mean, I know when we were first discussing this, the idea was, we discussed a few different ideas of what we could bring up today, really, particularly because domestic abuse by its very nature is such a broad spectrum.
Yeah.
And we were looking at its links with social housing, and actually
Yes.
talk about, you know, multi-agency meetings and things like that. And just before the meeting today, you and I were discussing how sometimes housing was seen as, well, why are they at the table? Why are they here?
Yeah.
There's been that shift towards a real need for housing at the table. And actually, I remember the Domestic Violence Commissioner's report, I can't remember if it was end of last year, beginning of this year, which said that, you know, housing was just a tiny part of what's gone on. And I was thinking, well, if you haven't got the housing right, then nothing else is going to go.
Nothing else.
There has to be accommodation available. So, but you've mentioned before that those relationships between the two aren't as strong. So, in your opinion, kind of where does it, I guess, fall down, and what does it need to look like?
So it really needs to look like, so all the work.
Sorry, just 2 seconds. I realised I didn't do any housekeeping. Please feel at any point to put whatever you like in the chat, and I will bring that into the conversation if you want to. Alternatively, and it'd be amazing if you feel comfortable, please use the raise hand function at any time. I will bring you into the conversation. We want this to be as open a conversation as we can. Judith, back to you.
No, fine. So yeah, so everything. So I'm the Daha Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance Programme manager, and I work within an organisation called Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse. So this organisation pioneered the what we call coordinated community response, which is an American model, the Duluth model, as it's often known, created by Ellen Pence in America, and Standing Together brought it over here, and we've been working on the coordinated community response across the Tri-Borough of London. I can't remember the name. I'm not a London person, but anyway. So we've been working as an organisation. We've got the different teams that would sort of cover the coordinated community response. So just a sort of very brief overview of what that is. Effectively, it is based on the principle that no single agency can possibly see the full picture of the lives of somebody who is living with domestic abuse. And we kind of extend that out to thinking about the whole family who are living with domestic abuse. So you've got your adult victim, your child victims, and your perpetrator. So by one single agency trying to resolve the problem. So let's say the police coming in and arrest, going through the prosecution, blah, blah, blah. If we don't involve other agencies to meet the needs of the individuals or the whole family but also not just meeting the needs, but thinking about what each of those organisations and which of those agencies know information about those individuals or the whole family, then and don't talk to each other, then we're never going to resolve this issue. And I think, you know, my background is kind of MARAC implementation and working across swathes of the country, covering an area with 52 MARACs, is really kind of understanding through that housing appeared to be almost the poor cousin of the rest of the organisation. So the go-to in people's heads is prosecution. Okay, we need to get the police involved. It's a police problem. In where there's children, it's children's social care problems, a safeguarding problem. We need to get them. They need to do all of the work. And just thinking about, they've got drug and alcohol problems. They've got mental health problems. It's those agencies that need to do it. But people were, even though housing was one of the core agencies to attend MARAC, it was always a little bit of a confusion as to who was to attend. And the core agency is still the homelessness housing options team, the ones with the statutory understanding and ability and the information about applying for housing, homelessness and that kind of thing to come to the, but again, it's kind of missing that point of local housing providers being part of those multi-agency discussions. And I think just the realization that actually, you know, the very basics, that having a home is a very basic human right, and thinking about landlords how much information they have and they know about the families who live in their properties, how much access they have to them. They are so vital in this coordinated community response. And if we miss them out, we're missing out a really crucial part of the puzzle, because that's what it, that's what
the housing side, because evidently housing aren't as if that, you know, so sometimes they themselves can be doing more as well. And I do think that that balance between the two. So is it that housing are quite, do you feel they've you know, embraced that kind of step back role? They've enjoyed that step back role and just kind of done what they need to, or do you think they haven't in the same way?
I think there's a bit of all sorts of things, Matt. I think it's they've maybe not, because I say sat back or step back, but maybe the big part of it is they didn't know their responsibilities, and they didn't know, having not always been, and certainly with social housing providers, not always been at the table or ever invited to the tables, you know, talking about DV forums, DA partnerships, those kind of things, not really understanding that they have a role to play in terms of that coordinated community response. So of course they're going to focus on whatever they need to focus on. You know, one of the sort of prime examples is antisocial behaviour, an ever increasing problem. And, you know, rents and rent incomes, and, you know, now obviously disrepair and managing repairs and things like that. Those the focuses. What, you know, our role is to sort of help organisations, housing organisations, to understand that domestic abuse is a societal problem. We see it as a housing issue because it's the biggest cause of homelessness in women. And if they want to reduce and prevent homelessness, then we have to talk about and address domestic abuse, and that housing have such a vital role to play. And one of the other sort of core principles of coordinated community response is to hold perpetrators to account. And it's really interesting for any of us who've been, and I know I can see Sean here, been in the domestic abuse sector for many years, that we didn't used to talk about perpetrators, the people who cause the harm. We didn't really talk about them. We focused completely on survivors. What is it that survivors need? Really important. But here we are, sort of 20 years later in the sector, and we're still seeing similar statistics, if not higher. Domestic abuse is getting higher. And we haven't looked at how do we stop the perpetrator. So one of the questions, the age-old questions that keeps being asked, is why doesn't she just leave? And what I used to see in these multi-agency meetings was the chair or whoever sort of leading the meeting, particularly statutory agencies, looking to housing and saying, you just need to move her. She just needs to move. Let's get her out. If she wants to be safe, the language is really important here. If she wants to be safe, she'll just move. And we've needed to do this for a very long time, is flip that narrative and say, hang on, stop, she wants to stay. What can we do in housing and all of the other agencies? What can we do to enable her to stay safe in her own home, where she has her family connections, where the children go to school, blah, blah, blah. Why should they disrupt their lives? What are we doing? And I do this massive we when I talk. That sounds terrible. But so it's that emphasis on the us. What are we doing about the perpetrator? What can we do to remove that perpetrator? What can we do to rehouse that perpetrator so that they don't harass and come back? And, you know, like I say, sort of going back, and I know I'm going off on millions of tangents here, I feel so passionate about housing's response. This is the most sort of passionate I've felt back in the whole sector, is just that if we do something about the perpetrator, if we rehouse them, if we actually ask them, what is it that you need, because there's something going on there, so they need that sort of specialist support, but actually they need to be housed. So it's something else that the sector need to think about. And there are some projects and some organisations out there doing some really good things about removing perpetrators from a property, but finding them accommodation so that they can then
that came on Inside Housing. I think it was Judith Vickress from Solace Women's Aid was saying that between 21 and 22, 24% increase in homelessness because of domestic abuse. And that is a big issue. I'm going to bring Sharon in because I can see you're patiently waiting, but I could see that you put in the chat there that sharing information wasn't something that used to happen. So how did you get anything done? But do come in, Sharon. You're brilliant.
Yeah, so I mean, I've worked in the sector for coming up to 25 years now, and too long, really. And I kind of worked in Westminster, so the tri-boroughs, Westminster, Kensington, Chelsea, and Hammersmith and Fulham. And so I used to work a lot with Standing Together, actually, and Megan Field is one of my close friends and former colleagues as well. But my point is, years ago, when I worked in refuge, there was no information sharing.
No.
You know, you didn't share information with anybody. If the police called the refuge and said, you know, I need to know if so and so's there, no, not telling you. No.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know now, looking back, I don't know how we ever got anything done. For the women, in this case, it was a refuge for women. And I must admit, I had my doubts when all this sort of started coming up, the community response and sharing information, and I thought, I don't know, it's just going to work, you know. But it just so does. You have to work in partnership. You know, you have to work in partnership together and share information. Obviously,
what were the barriers to that? So Sharon, sorry, from your experience, what were the barriers to working in partnership? You know, why wasn't it done, I guess, in the way that it needs to be?
I just think, you know, years ago, you know, if you were experiencing domestic abuse, the only thing you could do really was go into refuge. I mean, I've lost track of the amount of women that have felt felt that it, you know, they're being punished by having to leave their homes and go into miles away into refuge. You know, nobody would ideally share a house with 6 or 7 other women and a lot of children. You know, that is not the ideal. And there was just no other choice. You couldn't stay in your home. You know, children's services would say, well, you've got a choice. This was one that I distinctly remember from years ago. You've got a choice, but if you don't go into refuge, we're going to remove your child. Well, that's not a choice. That is not a choice to that woman, you know?
No.
So the fact that we've kind of moved away, I mean, obviously for a lot of women, refuge will be the answer and the only option for them. But we have to have more, you know, we have to be more mindful that most women don't want to leave their home. Why should they? Keep him or her or whoever we're talking about, you know? Sorry, I really get on my soapbox about this.
My soapbox is bigger than yours. That's what I always say to her.
Oh, do you want to bet?
Yeah. I've had to move because I can't get the soapboxes in. But I couldn't agree more. And I think you know, what I say to organisations that we work with is when you're sitting around that table, where you're having those multi-agency discussions, is when somebody's telling you, because it still happens every single day, why, you know, she needs to move, you need to move her. It's like, and I'd love advisors to be doing this more as well, is stop and just say, hang on a minute. She wants to stay. What are we doing to enable her to stay? And that means, what are we doing? And look around the table and say, what are we doing about the perpetrator? And let's start flipping that, and let's start putting that emphasis on the perpetrator. I think one of the things we talk about, like you say, Sharon, refuge really isn't for everybody. In fact, it isn't for most. And it's a great option. It's a very, very vital, important option, but we need to enable women who we need to give them the choices, and we need to enable them to stay safe in their own home if that is possible. And you know, that means we all have to pull up our socks, work really hard, put everything in place that we can do to make that home safe, and listen to her. What does she need? What does she want? What's the risk? Victim survivors are experts in their perpetrators. We need to listen to them. We need to hear them. And we need to be talking to each other. We need to be picking up that phone, so old-fashioned, but we need to be talking to each other. And I think one of the frustrating things,
phone can be so much better than email, and in person. I think sometimes email
so much better. And I think, you know, just even the people, you know, we don't meet in person so often anymore, but this is just as good. Let's have those conversations. We don't, you know, let's stop waiting for multi-agency meetings like MAPPAs and MARACs. Let's do, because the work actually happens in between. The MARACs are just the belt and braces meeting. They're not the answer. So we're just talking about this morning because we've got MARAC coordinators here at Stand Together, and it's, you know, organisations waiting for that MARAC meeting or putting referrals into MARAC, say, I've done my bit, it's in MARAC now, MARAC will sort it, MARAC's a magic wand. It doesn't work like that. Each agency needs to be doing what they can do to reduce the risk, and working and talking to each other. And I think, you know, Sharon, that sort of frustration around information sharing is still, even though it may be better, every domestic homicide review that we read, every serious case review, every serious adult review that we read, mental health review, all talks about still the lack of information sharing. And
well, on the information sharing, I'm going to bring in Claire Patterson. I mean, this is such a massive part of Claire. Claire specialises in data protection and data specialism.
Oh, I love it.
On that anyway. Good to have you with us, Claire.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, as I was just expecting Matt to not be surprised that I wanted to jump in on the information sharing, and I just want to say it's a really fine line though, that there's so much to balance about how you actually share that information, and you know, why and in what format. And actually what you said about picking the phone up or having a Zoom call like this is brilliant, because that's safer as well.
Yes,
if you're emailing,
yeah,
it's written down and it can go to the wrong person, or it can be forwarded on. So that, you know, these little kind of logistical things and practical things are really important. But also the main thing I bang on about with information sharing, actually the word sharing makes it sound a little bit too friendly. And I think if you think of it as information disclosure or disclosing data, it makes it feel a little bit more risky, because it is really risky. But there are the two things that I always say to people: having an information sharing protocol or agreement or anything like that does not make it lawful to share information with the people that are signed up to it. But conversely, you don't have to have an agreement in place to share information. And that, I see that all the time with the police, with local authorities, with housing associations. Oh, we can't talk to you until you sign this massive big document that actually doesn't do anything and is not legally binding. And you can share data if there is a legal purpose for it.
Yes, you
can disclose information. Obviously being really careful that who you're speaking to is who they claim to be. You know, you're not going, oh, well, you're the police, so that's fine, I can tell you everything, and it turns out it's not the police, it's the perpetrator or a friend of the perpetrator, all those sorts of things. And that has happened in housing, where perpetrators have found the address of their victims and gone on to attack them. So it's a really fine line, is all I wanted to say, basically, in a long way round.
No, but it's a really important one to make, and I think there is a whole piece there around. There is a fear of information sharing, and people get it wrong and get it right, and I very, very much agree with you. I think a lot of this appears to be, and please, Judith or anybody else, correct me if I'm wrong, because I feel it's an issue throughout social housing and indeed kind of public sector, is this piece around kind of ownership.
Yes.
Who's actually going to take ownership for this? Who's going to be the people who say, and I know a conversation you and I had before, which said that there should be no single person or single entity going, right, it's ours. there needs to be something or someone kind of saying, actually, you know what, I'm just going to sort this. And I don't think we see enough of that in housing in a lot of different areas, unfortunately. I don't know what your findings are, Judith, particularly from these MAPA and MARAC meetings.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think it is really important. And obviously within multi-agency working, you do have organisations who have statutory duties to safeguard individuals, and they do tend to take the lead. And I think there's a difference between taking the lead and then perhaps controlling what goes on and ordering everybody to do this, that and the other, which we used to see quite a lot in the MARACs that I used to observe. So often led by the police, chaired by the police, and perhaps the police kind of dictating what happened in those forums. So there does need to be a lead, but that lead then needs to really understand what collaboration means. And collaboration means that sort of equal partnership, equal voice amongst all of the organisations. And I think there's quite a good example, and slightly menopausal brain, apologies, and this is awful because I can't remember the surname of the boy who was murdered. Serious case review of Arthur, I'm pretty sure it was, where the children's social care obviously leading the response and leading the sort of child protection conferences, told very clearly, and concerns raised by health, that this little boy was, you know, potential to die unless we do something now. On Friday, and by Monday he was dead. And I might have got the child wrong, but it's because that's not an equal partnership. It's children's social care leading it. We know what we're doing. We'll leave it till Monday. We'll do this. And I think we really need, so it is important to have that lead, but it is important that lead organisation who takes accountability, who takes responsibility to lead, doesn't take responsibility away from everywhere else. Like I mentioned about sort of MARAC, there's a kind of terrible culture nationally. It's not any particular area of I've made a referral to MARAC, that's my responsibility gone. And we need to kind of change that attitude and change and that's kind of rife through housing as well, is okay, I've assessed the risk to be at high, I've made the referral to MARAC, that's me done. And in not even attending the meeting or whatever and finding out what's going on. Thank you, Sian. So I think it's just really important that we understand what that collaboration looks like. And yes, there may need to be a lead, but it just really needs to be in a collaborative way. And I think just coming back to information sharing, another kind of, well, the biggest barriers to information sharing is human fear. So, and human lack of training, skills, knowledge, understanding of GDPR, which anybody who knows me as a bit of a geek, I love it. A framework that presented to us that allows us to share information in the safest possible way. You can put your shoes in the person of somebody who's having their information shared, and feel if everybody's following the general data protection regulations, they are going to be in safe hands. But what's happened and what we're seeing, and I'm kind of tasked with writing a perpetrator guidance for housing from our national housing group at the moment, and one of those areas is that the legal departments within housing have almost kind of got a blanket, oh, GDPR means we can't share any information. And so
that isn't just housing. We had exactly the same recruitment, people saying, well, you can't send you've got a GDPR sign off. No, you can, because there's mutual interest. It's fine. You can share that information. Okay.
There's 6 lawful bases, what we see, and we see this is rife in children's social care as well, is we need consent. We need consent of the parent who is possibly abusing that child. We need their consent before we can share any information, or we can ask for any information. So we forget about asking for information. And I think, you know, like Claire said, it's about the purpose, really clear purpose, and then what's relevant, proportionate to achieving that purpose. And consent is often not the best lawful basis for sharing information, and it's certainly not the lawful basis for sharing information through multi-agency.
Claire's just putting it back there. We do not need consent to be able to safeguard people.
Exactly.
Arthur Labinjo, who's being the obviously the young boy there in the case that you mentioned. Do you think, and again, you know, if anybody else wants to dive in, please do. But do you believe there is an issue with, we know there's a massive issue in terms of a lack of accommodation. We know there's a big issue with move on accommodation. But there's also been a huge piece of a lack of trust with supported exempt accommodation providers and everything else going on there, which are popping up more and more regularly. I know, again, you and I have talked about this, and we are seeing more kind of coming through. People feeling that businesses feeling like people are stepping on their toes, kind of going, well, we do the support in this area, but enough support, so someone has to come in and do it. How do we get that that balance between making sure that we've got enough accommodation available, but also that accommodation is being dealt with at the right level? Because at the end of the day, if you have got people who are wanting to set this up, all of the media narrative is they're all rogues and they're all a nightmare. I know first from recruiting for a number of them, they absolutely aren't. There's a number that are, don't get me wrong, but there's also a lot that aren't. But if you speak to them, you understand their empathy for the sector and why they want to help. And I think sometimes that's what's being forgotten, is that actually there are businesses out there that are very empathetic towards wanting to help, but then are being treated as if they're rogues or whatever will be in the first place. So you could find, well, we won't do it. And then we carry on with this issue of there hasn't been enough accommodation built from central government over the last 10, 15 years. Someone's got to do it.
Yeah, no, I think it's exactly. I think, you know, the domestic abuse
partnerships, that's a huge piece.
It's a huge piece. Exactly. That is the answer, effectively, that it has to be a partnership thing. And, you know, the Domestic Abuse Act and Part 4 of the Domestic Abuse Act talking about safe accommodation, and each local authority having to submit and create and submit their strategies and do a needs assessment. So, you know, I'd guess probably a majority, if not all, local authorities discovered that they had a lot of unmet need, and they were looking, certainly when I worked in the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office, I had lots of conversations with strategists and commissioners, and what can we do because we haven't got these connections with our housing providers. I remember one area particularly where 69 units short of what they needed according to their needs assessment for survivors of domestic abuse, and having difficulties with their local providers, housing providers, who perhaps were saying, we don't do domestic abuse. And that was a quote from one of them, is just you know, building those relationships. And what has been really positive, and I meet with them at DLUC every month, I feel because I know it's been fraught with difficulties and it's been a lot of pressure for local authorities, but what has been really positive is that we've seen such a huge increase or improvement in the relationship between social housing providers, registered providers, and their local authorities. And where sometimes those relationships were very, very difficult, we've seen an improvement in the Tier 1 and Tier 2 local authority relationships. And we've also seen in Daha a huge increase in local authorities coming to us to work towards our accreditation, so adopting and embedding standards of good practice. And that can only be really positive. And I think what has been created is almost this like hotbed of opportunity for landlords who maybe haven't thought about getting into the domestic abuse field and thinking, oh, there's some money there, maybe we'll just go into that domestic abuse field, because with Domestic Abuse Act obviously came quite a lot of money into the sector, and So I think there's a real balance. There is a real concern, as the Levelling Up Committee report that was published a couple of weeks ago really highlighted, and it was a really good report because it really talked about the mess of the exempt accommodation market and field effectively, and that because there's no regulation, there's no current licensing registration, some areas are doing really well at thinking about standards of good practice and having regulation, and Birmingham in particular, where the problem is really significant. But like you say, Matt, it does kind of have this broad brush approach of all landlords who aren't registered, who are coming into this sector are rogues. If they're not like social housing, they're rogues. And I think in our response, one of the things that I said was we have to be really careful, because registration doesn't mean good. I mean, look what's going.
It's taking more than 2 years to get registered now.
Exactly.
So want to be registered and can't.
Yeah, there has to be a system. There has to be a system that is open for all, because we've really kind of thought about balancing. There are lots of small providers. I mean, by its very nature, supported housing is exempt accommodation. There's many small, particularly buy and for services. So those organisations that are set up by a community for that community, where they've got accommodation, and actually putting an onerous kind of responsibility on them to register and license themselves is going to be really difficult, because they haven't. So it almost instantly has this kind of concern about, because we do a lot about anti-racism and thinking about how, as a society built on racism, that we're perpetuating that by demanding this of smaller organisations. So we've kind of.
Sharon, I've got her waiting as well.
Go on, Sharon.
Go for it, Sharon. I'm going to bring you.
I'll talk all day. So.
Oh no! Don't complain at all. It's great, Sharon. Over to you. Now I'm going to jump into the chat.
Yeah, I don't know whether I know I've mentioned this in another roundtable of yours, Matt, but the project that we've been, so I work for NCDB, but I've been solely working in partnership with Places for People Housing Association, which is based up north, but they have housing stock all over the country, and I've been working with them, or we'll be talking about it at the conference tomorrow, actually, Matt, a peer mentoring project. So been taking, getting people that have been through domestic abuse, that live in Places for People housing stock, and they're kind of sufficiently down the road and on the way to, recover from their experiences, and training them to be peer mentors to other people that are in their housing stock, that are going through or have recently been through domestic abuse. So the idea being is that they are supported in their own homes by somebody that has been through that experience and can advise them. No way are they kind of trained up to be an IDVA or anything like that. But just purely on the sort of emotional support, and that it's been a slow burn, but that is going really, really well, and it kind of gives, it not only gives support to people that are going through it now and that need that peer mentor support, but it also is giving skills and knowledge to people that have been through it and want to give something back. So that's kind of the way I've been working on that project with Places for People for nearly a year now, but it is going to be ongoing for them, although I will kind of step away soon from my part of it. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that into the mix. Really.
I think it's really, really interesting to look at these projects. Having a look through the chat there, Patterson had mentioned earlier that there's an organisation that provides support to perpetrators who want to stop, which is respectuk.net. Carolyn Mann, I don't know if it's Caroline or Caroline, apologies. Sharing premises to make it easier to work with partners. Is that you? I don't mind Gabby jumping off mute for a second. Is that sharing between domestic abuse services and your housing provider? What does that look like?
At Eastlight Community Homes, we have a community hub on our ground floor, which we share with partners. And we have a domestic abuse charity next chapter there. We have DWP, we have Essex Police, we have social care, we have Community 360, which is a voluntary sector organisation based in Colchester and Braintree, which has lots of different projects going on. So that's a great place for people to have those conversations if they need to. You know, if they're in on that day, you can just grab them. And
between you and them,
we have a partnership arrangement whereby they work in our offices, and to my knowledge, that's free space for them as well. So we're also DAHA accredited. Judith probably knows that.
Yes.
And we're coming up to, I think, our second year, I think.
No way, is it?
Something like that. I'm a domestic abuse champion, but my background is I'm not really involved in the domestic abuse work per se, because my role is insight and the customer experience. It's a different type of role. But I'm a DA champion because I used to work for victim support, and that was my passion. And I was involved in a lot of stuff around domestic abuse during my work with them and other third sectors as well. And I just want to keep involved in it because I think it's so important to try and influence as much as possible, you know, for the highest delivery of services that you can. And so, yeah, so if people disclose to me, I can provide support or signpost or whatever as a DA champion. But I think it's really important to keep the profile up within the business and keep banging on about it, because if you don't keep banging on about it, you know, you just have to. And if it's
otherwise something else just takes over as the lead conversation at the time, and there is still that issue between support providers and housing providers and the general public and trust across the board.
Absolutely.
I put on a poll last week, and actually one of the lead things there was that either victims don't know about services that are available or that they don't trust the system.
Yeah.
And they are absolutely key. And I can see from the chat there, Shamila said sharing contacts with domestic abuse teams and social housing partners would be helpful. So there is a contact to escalate. And obviously, Caroline, you've mentioned that you do that there. Sharing information on what support can be put in place by social housing providers, i.e. is there a threshold for management move? And Lucy said, I've made it my mission to know what the local IDVRs or outreach support workers are and keep in touch with them. I attend networking opportunities when I can, and as I'm the DA champion, trained by Reducing the Risk Oxfordshire and designated Marek officer, I get my name and the housing association I work for out there.
Yeah.
So others know who to contact if they have a housing query or working with one of our residents. Management moves are an interesting topic because different HAs have different eligibility criteria. And usually they are not a quick resolution like many other agencies, i.e. social services or police, seem to think they are. And I think anything in this sector sometimes does seem to move slower compared to other areas, Judith.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think, and it's so fantastic to hear about champions. We talk about champions a lot, and we've got a champions network creations kind of guidance, and we've got champions training, and because it's just really important. It's exactly what Carolyn said about banging on, and we have to keep banging on internally as well as externally. So we talk about that coordinated community response. That coordinated community response, CCR, starts internally and is as important as externally, because there are so many different and we've got to get our exec boards. You know, one thing we've kind of worked out really within DAHA is that it doesn't work if your exec board isn't bought in, and so we're doing much more work to bring them in right from the outset. But just to kind of,
how are you doing that? Because that's a really key point, because I was going to ask, obviously the key thing today was building those relationships, and if we go back to earlier on, domestic abuse services are doing some amazing work, some housing associations are doing some amazing work, but that link isn't there. So I guess what did domestic abuse services need to be doing, and what the housing associations need to be doing? Because as you said there, and this is why I jumped in on that point, so often it comes down to exec teams actually wanting to do something about it.
Absolutely. And so we require that exec boards sign off on membership, because DAHA's a membership project. So there is that requirement. Within the first 3 months, we will have had a conversation with the CEO to make sure that they are on board, and when they're not, we'll do whatever we need to do to support that. But if it means that an organisation isn't signing up or isn't committing to adopting and embedding standards of good practice, then we do a lot of work pre-sign up and pre-membership and pre the accreditation work, and we want organisations to come to us at the earliest point. It doesn't matter. Somebody described it as like us looking through the knicker drawer. It isn't about us judging an organisation that may not have a great response to domestic abuse. We want to get in there at the earliest opportunity, because we've got all of the sort of tools, the skills that we need to support getting that exec board on board. And we do a lot of strategic buy-in work. And
where's the communication from their side? What's stopping that being such a seamless transition, I guess? From your side, and Bomas, please be blunt. What is causing that lack of, I guess, ability just to work together on what should be a common goal?
Well, you're recording this, so I can't say exactly, but let's just say lack of diversity on boards can be a significant issue, and not necessarily talking about culture here, we're talking about gender. That does seem to be quite a significant barrier. It comes down to money. Priorities. So obviously we've got, and actually I'm working with our CEO tomorrow to update and upgrade our business case so that it's a bit more punchy, I guess, but convincing exec boards that actually this is because the human cost doesn't seem to cut it, which is really sad, because we do focus on the hearts and minds and the human cost of domestic abuse. So it's about that financial, and we've got all of the evidence to demonstrate that this is financially something that's really important to invest in, that actually by tackling and dealing and providing a good response to domestic abuse will actually prevent homelessness, save you the money on voids, save you the money on repairs. Will help you deal with antisocial behaviour that is currently taking up all of that time, all of that money that's going on. So much, I think 65+% of antisocial behaviour is rooted in domestic abuse. And we need to
bring something up about culture, because actually I think one thing we haven't really talked about, and when we talked about perpetrators and victims leaving and things like that, was very much that in some cultures that's just not acceptable. And the way that comes through. But I'm going to dive back. So we've got Carolyn there, but on the chat as well, there was Vicky Bevington. Lovely to have you with us, Vicky. As a domestic abuse charity, we sit under the umbrella of a group alongside staff housing. It's enabled us to have a great
Honeycomb group. Honeycomb, yeah.
Yeah, Honeycomb, brilliant. It's enabled us to have a great relationship.
Fantastic.
We support housing officers with any cases they have to offer domestic abuse support, but also they support us with move on support and provide us with DA community accommodation. It's so valuable working together, and what's clear there is if they weren't, it wouldn't work. And then, Sian, this is what we need in Gloucestershire. We are trying to get agreement for funding to ensure all districts can sign up to DAHA, plus employ countrywide support. We may need a presentation to partners. And I think, as we said earlier on, I guess, Judith, one of the key things in this is that we keep having the conversation. Carolyn, I'm going to bring you back in because so you had to end up there. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to make as well, we really try to share this across the whole of the business, and it's really important, like, your frontline staff, we have proper training for them to raise awareness of domestic abuse, and so they can flag up any concerns through to our safeguarding team. And also, economic abuse, it's really important for your income teams and finance teams to have an awareness of the impact of economic abuse and how wide-ranging that abuse can be, and how many victims of it may not even recognise that that is the case. So that's another really important part of it, is with that kind of like embracing it Daha, and embracing that work, you're really making sure that you're giving all of your staff the skills, knowledge to be able to at least flag it up, you know what I mean, whereas, and also in their own personal relationships as well. So it's it's a really good piece of work to try and get done if you can.
I'm a massive advocate for social housing providers, but and Judith, you may choose not to answer this question, which is fine, but is there an element of arrogance from housing sometimes, or do domestic abuse providers believe there's an arrogance from housing providers that they know how it's done, so they don't push it hard enough, and housing providers go, well, they're not telling us anything we don't know already?
Yeah, Matt, we see that all the time. We see it all the time, and we see it in our training, that we know this stuff anyway, and we know what domestic abuse is. We are specialists. I mean, that's a real rub between the sectors, is, you get like a local authority that may have a team of about 10 people where the domestic abuse kind of cases come through, and they're calling themselves specialists, and then that's damaging their relationship with their local domestic abuse services. And partnership is such an important part of what we're trying to build and achieve with the accreditation. And it's really clear, we're really clear on this, that this is about the housing response to domestic abuse, that needs to be good, and it's not about the domestic abuse response, because you're not the specialists. It's about who is your specialist organisation in your local area, how well are you working with them, and how do those referral pathways work, and how are you working with them. But you're not specialist, you're housing specialist, and let's keep it like that. But you have a really good understanding of the dynamics of the coercive controlling behaviour. You can identify it early, you know how to respond in the most positive and validating way, and then you know how to engage that person so that they can then engage with the specialist organisations, and you don't duplicate work, you work well together. And one of the things we're pushing housing providers to do, we've got two levels of accreditation, so it's foundation and enhanced. And for enhanced, we're looking at what is it that you locally provide in terms of support and backing, if you like, for your local domestic abuse services. So is there a project that you can fund? Is there a support that you can give to your local service? Because there is, regardless of what we hear, there is money in social housing organisations. There is money in the sector, and we want to see much more investment and close working relationships. And just kind of going back a bit, Matt, because you did ask about what are we doing about the improving the relationship, if you like, or building the relationship between domestic abuse services and housing. So one of the first things I did when I came into Daha was set up 9 regional groups, with the purpose that we have only housing local authorities and domestic abuse services from those regions. So we've got, for instance, just thinking of northwest, northeast, Yorkshire. So we have those organisations are invited. We've got sort of roughly about 40 members in each, and they don't always come, but the idea was to bring that connection, to bring that sort of build that relationship. And the best thing that I've seen is that kind of connection that has happened in those areas. And I remember one women's aid organisation being contacted by strategic lead in the local authority, and that organisation had been there for years and they've never really had a good relationship, and that relationship is now built, and they're managing kind of refuge services. They've got new properties for refuge. I think one of the things that was really positive over in one of the Midlands meetings that we have was commissioners saying, we've got this needs assessment, we haven't got enough properties, we need more refuge space, we need some dispersed refuge space. you know, for male victims, for trans victims. We need all of these things, but we haven't got that sort of bricks and mortar housing provider there. We've never been asked. So hang on, let's just have a conversation outside of here. They've now provided 5 properties to that local authority to be able to have move on accommodation.
About just getting the conversation started.
It is just and it's about building those connections and both of them seeing the value of each other. And that's one of the things I think we've been able to facilitate is the understanding of the value of all of those organizations in that CCR. And you know, one of our kind of missions is to build the status of housing within that CCR. So it's not just about you know, the victim survivors, but it's like building the status of housing. One of the things we're working on is
realizing just how important they are. I'm going to bring Carolyn in.
Yeah,
so
sorry.
No, don't be at all. Carolyn, please. And then there's a question from Aria in the chat, which I'll come to in a moment. But Carolyn, over to you.
I just wanted to emphasise the fact that what Judith is saying is that we don't put ourselves out as being the experts, and we work very closely with our domestic abuse charities in the area. We also have the perpetrator programme working in our community hub as well. So we've got both the support for the victim and guidance on and from the perpetrator, you know, programme there, plus children's social care and adult social care. Historically, when I worked in domestic abuse back in the day, there was a lot of friction between individual organisations with each other, and there was a lot of it was mostly because of funding, and you know, the people wanted to protect their funding and protect their teams and protect their staff. So there was a lot of infighting and a lot of almost bullying behavior, you know, about it within the sector, which is very unpleasant, but nevertheless it was there, and probably to some degree in some areas could still well be there. So you have to really be very diplomatic and a very good you know, a diplomatic person and a very good negotiator and a very good reassurer to build these partnerships sometimes because of those historic situations, and be clear on your objectives and really fight for the cause of the victims and the better, you know, victim-centered approach to overcome those barriers, you know.
Judith,
and not
talked about this over this last week in terms of there are still very much people who are going, well, we control this area, we know what goes on with domestic abuse services. Someone else coming in and going, great, well, we can offer an extra, you know, up to 30, 40, 50 beds over a number of different sites. You'd have thought they've been brilliant, fantastic. The support is there, and instead it's, this is our area. We have the monopoly here. You shouldn't be here, kind of thing. And then kind of immediate distrust and immediately back foot, rather than going, well, why are you here and how real are you? And they're going, well, we've spoken to the commissioners, we've been in touch with the police, XYZ. We know we're doing things right. But there is very much still that
territorial,
no, very much territorial distrust, unfortunately, and that's again just another barrier in the sector, and it's a real shame, but it's also one that goes on in housing in general, because housing is constantly fighting over stock and what's going on there.
You're right, and I'll put in the chat. I'm not good at multitasking. The link to Standing Together report called In Search of Excellence, and that's about how to sort of put together the CCR in your local area. And one of the chapters on that I wrote around exactly what Carolyn's just said, effectively how the competitive sort of field, particularly in the domestic abuse sector, has created all of these problems, when actually we need to almost get over ourselves and remind ourselves who are we here for, and it's for survivors, and we need to knock our heads together, get together, and actually commissioners have a big part to play in this. Is that we've, you know, PCCs and local authority commissioning need to come together, work together, and just say, hey, all of you services in this area, we've got this pot of funding, how are we going to spread it out so that we're not duplicating work? And in some areas that the CCR is working really well. So we've got Nottinghamshire that have got a really good model for commissioning, and they are very collaborative. So PC, starting at PCC and local authority commissioner level, they pool their funds. They have this umbrella sort of fund, and they get all of the services together to say who wants what effectively. It's being a bit sort of flippant, but that works really well. We've got a fantastic model in Plymouth called the Plymouth Alliance, and they they're your home team. It works incredibly. I mean, they've trolled over, that's the wrong word, but they've worked really hard since 2012 to build this sort of public health model where they all work really, really closely together, and they're looking at sort of how the CCR, each of the sort of chapters, each of the sort of aspects of the CCR coming together and making sure that that's working. And they've worked really hard on it, and they're really open to other areas picking up on what they're doing, and not go through all of the pain that they went through in terms of partnership working, but actually just, you know, see how they work now and get over those hurdles much quicker. And I know as part of the role I had in the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office as geographic lead, we were looking at what good looks like and highlighting and celebrating good practice. And I know that that's continued, and Nicole's doing a lot more. But Plymouth and Nottingham were most definitely areas that we looked at. Hull as well. Hull have always worked incredibly well as a partnership. They've got the Hull Domestic Abuse Partnership, and that's been around for a long time, and they work incredibly well. The local authority are really good. They're our only enhanced accredited provider at the moment. And
that between the housing, the local authority and the services, that's so essential. I mean, I can see that areas put in the chat. I'm not sure if you've already touched this point, as far as where we haven't. What is the housing refuge situation for domestic violence victims with no recourse to public funding, especially those with insecure immigration status from minority communities?
It's not good enough is still the answer to that, unfortunately. And we're really lucky to have a domestic abuse commissioner who is like a dog with a bone and will not let this one go. And she's working really, really hard with our Home Secretaries, and say with a huge sigh, because the migrant survivors were most definitely missed off the Domestic Abuse Act. Nicole's working very hard to get them into the Victims Bill, but I don't know where that's going to be. So they're just about to launch the second migrant survivor report. I think that's due for launch on the 13th. And there are real issues with no recourse to public funds, and the barriers for women. I think the report is called Safety Before Status, and it's just so important that the government puts safety before status, and we need, because we're just handing perpetrators of domestic abuse the most perfect tool to say, do as I say. I am your dictator. I will control you. You will die if you don't do what I say, because otherwise you're going to go back to the country that we came from, because you've got insecure immigration status, and the fear that causes, removal of passports. There's such an issue, and it's always been an issue, and we really thought the Domestic Abuse Bill was the perfect opportunity to change that. But our last two, and our last one and current Home Secretaries are just not for it at all, and it's really problematic. And
on that.
I know it's hard. I had to bite my old tongue there, but it's just such an important area, and I know that Nicole is not going to let it go. So I feel really positive that one day we'll get there. But at the moment, we're relying on organisations, so charitable funds, grant funds, local authorities or organisations that will set aside funds that were, so like, I know in the refuge that Sian and I used to work at, the refuges that we used to work at, we had, I think, one space that we could keep open sometimes for somebody with no recourse to public funds. And that's what we're looking at. So their choices are very limited. So going back to that kind of exempt accommodation, those landlords coming in who may be unscrupulous, is that we're targeting the most vulnerable people in our society, and you know, migrants tend to be the most vulnerable, and you know, giving them access to somebody that appears safe feels like a really good thing, but actually the support they're getting is inferior or non-existent. And we've just, so there's just a kind of thinking about that exempt stuff. We've talked about this, Matt, but you know, there are concerns about making everybody go through registration, but actually there should be no loopholes. And if you are providing a good service, you won't fear that regulation. And what we do need to do is make sure we have a government who ensures that regulation is achievable by all and accessible to all, and whether that's additional funding for some smaller organisations. We need to think about that, because the accommodation does need to be there. It needs to be safe. There are too many gaps. There's not enough refuges. There's not enough safe accommodation. So we have to fill it somehow. And if that's going to be private landlords, then we've got to make sure that it's good enough and that they're safe. There's just a couple of things because I will forget. Just on East Light, Carolyn, because I did the assessment, and that's why I said I can't believe it's 2 years ago. But one of the best housing providers that we've got in terms of their practice. So if anybody is thinking of working towards accreditation and wanting some kind of peer support, without asking Carolyn, I would say have a look and see what Eastlight doing. Their community hub was one of the celebrations we've done in the 16 days, because it is a really good example of partnership working. And just another thing, I saw a question about management transfers, and interestingly, because we review the standards every year, and we'll be reviewing them in February. One of the things that we will be looking to do going forward is, currently we ask for domestic abuse policies, and we review policies and we make sure that there's accompanying procedures and everything, it's all embedded. But we don't look at other policies, and so we're going to change that, because we've realised that we really need to look at management transfer policies, because there was a recent, some of you will know, there was a recent judicial review, R versus Network Homes. Do you know that?
No, I was saying bye to Sharon. I can see a number of people having to go. That was all.
So it's worth looking at R versus Network Homes, just to have a look at that. They had we actually provided a statement for that case as well, but it was their management transfer policy effectively said there has to be a risk to life and limb. And it just put the level sort of so high that domestic abuse victims basically, just had to have a gun to the head effectively, before they could be put forward for a management transfer. And that has, this judicial review has kind of shown that is not, acceptable, that it's too high a threshold, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to be starting to look at management transfer policies and making sure that they are everything that we ask everything to be. So believing of the victim survivor, non-judgmental, that they're accessible, that they are survivor focused, survivor led, all of those things that we ask for. And if any of their policies are not like that, then they won't achieve accreditation. So it's a kind of going to be a bit of a change.
If you can share that, I can circulate that anyway. And just linked to that on the previous point. There was a question there from Sean, who I'm going to get you to ask your question, because I'm not quite sure. You said RPF, and apologies, my knowledge of...
No worries. Hi, Judith. I was just wondering, you mentioned about in the olden days when we used to have a room reserved for somebody with no recourse to public funds. And currently in Gloucestershire, myself and Caroline Lucas Moath, who's on the call, have been working on an expansion of the places of safety and commissioning many more places of safety across the county. And I was just thinking through, can we reserve a space or a pot of money for people with no recourse? And then I was thinking the next obstacle will be the right to rent issue. And I was wondering if you found a way around that, because I'm thinking that's what the housing associations will say next when I say, can you, we'll fund a little pot for this. I think that would be the next obstacle. And just wondering if there are any innovative ideas around that.
I think the only innovative ideas that we've seen come down to the effectively generosity of a local authority in how much funding they put aside and whether they can put aside enough for a certain period of time, renting accommodation to do all of that recovery work with somebody. And I know it may not be helpful, but in America, there is an area, and I can't remember, I think it's Washington, I'm not 100% sure, but I can let you know, Sean, where they provide 2 years worth of rent. So that to help build that recovery, and then thinking about getting somebody into employment, and whether that's going to be something that's sustainable, but it's also to help them get through the process that's required to get them the immigration status that they need. So yeah, I think it kind of there's nothing more than just an area providing more funding. So it's not just like 6 weeks in refuge, we can cover that. It's thinking more long term, and that is a huge ask. It's a huge ask. So but it's thinking, I guess, creatively on how to use some of that money. I think in the first year of the funding, the Part 4 money that came in, there had to be some rapid mobilisation of projects to use up the first year of money. So I think we saw some sort of shorter term projects coming then. But as we're waiting for the new allocations, which is going to be for 2 years this time, as far as I'm aware, I think we're probably going to see that reduce. But just to let you know that the DAC office mapping report is coming out next week. And that might provide some more kind of ideas, because I know they've got sort of examples of good practice in there. And I'm catching up with Nicole later, so I can ask more, because this is her passion area. So I can ask because I've not been there since April. So it'd be really interesting to know if there are areas that are doing it really well, and I could pass that on.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks, Judith. Carolyn, probably final question before we wrap up today. Over to you, Carolyn.
Well, it's not a question, actually. It was just picking up on what Sian said about, and I may have got this completely out of context and wrong, because I'm not a housing person really. I've just done it for a little while, so it's new to me. But I'm just wondering, I think what you were saying is that there is something preventing them from renting directly from the housing association because of their status. So could you not set up a quasi kind of like community interest company or something that is between the housing association and your pot of money, so that particular company or organisation rents the property or in some way legitimately, because housing associations can rent to businesses like garages and stuff like that if they've got them available. So there may be a way of setting up an organisation that becomes the person that's renting, and then you can avoid the direct link to the actual person who hasn't got the status. Just a thought.
It might be a solution, but it's that issue, isn't it, that the right to rent rules and to hold a tenancy or sign a license have particular restrictions about who can and can't, in order to stop people accessing those services who don't have recourse to public funding. So it's that barrier and how we jump over that, really.
Thank you. I think it's a really interesting idea, and the more ideas that can come back from these things and from just generally talking to each other is always going to be useful. Judith, I know there's a few links that have we talked about briefly today, so I'm going to get you to send me those before I send around the roundup and those kind of side of things. And you've just put the membership pack on the chat as well as your email address so that people can get in touch with you. Are there any kind of concluding points you'd like to make, Judith?
Oh, just no. Well, just no. Yes, I could go on forever. No, I think it's just it is just to keep banging on. I think Carolyn's coined it really well. We have to keep talking about domestic abuse. We have to make sure that housing really do recognise their role within the coordinated community response. I attend lots of kind of conferences, events, just to speak to kind of senior strategic leads within housing, CEOs, whatever, just to get them on. And it's interesting. We had someone here from Places for People. It was Sharon, wasn't it? Or talking about Places for People, because they're a huge organisation and they were on board, and then I don't know what happened, but the exec team for the next year decided we won't do domestic abuse this year, so they're now no longer working towards the accreditation, and I just, that makes me really sad, because it's just, you know, that we had a team there who were working really, really hard, really passionate about domestic abuse and improving response to domestic abuse. Got some very vulnerable tenants and people living in their accommodation all over the country. So, but with, you know, and I don't mind kind of naming them, because larger organisations like Clarion, Sanctuary, you know, that again at exec board level, at kind of some sort of senior management level, there's real sort of appetite to adopt and embed standards of good practice, but at senior level there's not that commitment at the exec board level. So there's a lot of work for us to do, for everybody to do with their exec boards. And you know, I'm working with our CEO tomorrow to put together, like I say, a bit more of a stringent business case, something that will kind of get the exec boards, because obviously what we're not doing is we're not doing enough, I think, and the hearts and minds, sadly, I mean, I can never leave it out. I can never ever leave it out. But the hearts and minds, it doesn't seem to cut it at the moment. So,
and housing, particularly amongst, and we've talked about this many times on the round table, the commercial element, and I mean, I'm even talking just this year, we had a number of events beginning of the year which said housing is all about having a commercial mind and a social heart, and actually that commercial mindset is unfortunately getting
much bigger and stronger. Yeah, yeah, most definitely.
Then you're finding that, you know, Michael Gove, regardless of thoughts on him and his history, he is now naming and shaming, and he has named and shamed in last week. And actually Inside Housing during this session today announced that actually the regulator knew about Rochdale Borough Council 2 years ago and just haven't published a report in 2 years. And so there is, housing in 2023 is really going to change. I think it's going to have to, but equally I don't think we can get away from the fact that it hasn't been properly funded in a decade from the local authority side. And so we can now start going, oh, it's all the housing association's fault, but actually
no.
Now we've been struggling.
And the target of 90,000 social housing properties a year, so, you know, not confusing it with affordable homes, is just feels unattainable at the moment. But if we have to sort of keep aiming for that. But it is interesting.
If the focus goes there, then the issue you have is that then people are going, well, why aren't you just looking after the stock you've got? And it's
exactly. And I think the AWAB case has really just kind of highlighted that. And it's also something that we just, I think what's really interesting is within DLUC and within sector, regardless of anybody's politics, I think people were quite pleased to see Michael Gove come back, because he is, he's a doer, he gets stuff done, he's a straight talker, and he will name and shame, and he does seem to get the social purpose and understanding of that. So long may it continue, because we have to improve. It has to change. It has to change. The social purpose.
There are some people in the sector who want it to, and I think that's where these roundtables is, because there's people who want to see change. I am aware we're running out of time. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone who came today. I will put a post up on LinkedIn and I'll get that side of things done. We are fast approaching one of the last roundtables of the year. Like I said, I've been running these now. We've done the equivalent of one every single week of the year. And they've never cost anyone a penny or anything like that. And we've got 2 left. So next week we've got Katie Bird, which is about having resources in place to be more proactive in housing. And then finally, just before Christmas, Jenny Blake's joining us to discuss the cycle of burnout. So I'm hoping you can join them there. There is a social housing roundtable group. Please join it. And as ever, looking forward to seeing you at future events. But Judith, for today, thank you so much.
Thank you. No, thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me. Take
Thanks,
care all.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.